The dense fog hung like a curtain over the remote station, blurring the sharp edges of the world and muffling every sound except for the slow, steady hiss of steam. Eleanor tightened her coat around her as she stepped onto the empty platform, her footsteps echoing in the vast silence. Ahead of her loomed the train, its metallic surface glinting faintly under the weak glow of the station lights. It looked ancient, yet unnervingly well-preserved, as if it had defied time itself. Eleanor's breath misted in the frigid air. She had been chasing the truth about the disappearances along this forgotten railway for months, and now, with a mixture of determination and unease, she was finally here. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her bag, where her notebook lay ready to capture every detail. A shuffling sound caught her attention, and she turned to see a man in his late 60s approaching, his face weathered and eyes shadowed. "You here for the last train?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. She nodded. "I'm Eleanor." "And you?" "Thomas," he replied, his gaze shifting nervously to the train. "You shouldn't be here." Before she could respond, the train's whistle pierced the air, a sound too deep and mournful for an ordinary departure. The heavy doors creaked open, revealing a dimly lit interior. Eleanor hesitated, but her resolve held firm. As she stepped aboard, the faint sensation of being swallowed by something immense and alive unsettled her. The train let out a groan, its walls seeming to breathe as the doors shut behind her. Thomas followed, muttering under his breath. The train lurched forward, beginning its journey into the unknown. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the track filled the carriage, but it did little to drown out the oppressive silence among the passengers. Eleanor sat near the window, her notebook open on her lap. She scribbled observations. Fog thickens. Passengers tense. Train feels alive. Across the aisle, Thomas stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. The other passengers avoided eye contact, their faces pale and drawn. The air inside the carriage felt unnaturally heavy, pressing down on them as if the train itself were aware of their presence. Hours passed, and Eleanor's unease deepened. The lights flickered periodically, casting long shadows that seemed to shift and move on their own. She heard faint whispers, too soft to make out the words, but unmistakably there. They seemed to seep from the walls, growing louder whenever the train entered a tunnel. Unable to ignore it, Eleanor rose and walked through the narrow corridor, hoping to find some answers. She passed through several empty carriages, each colder and darker than the last. In one, she found an old leather journal tucked beneath a seat. Its cracked cover bore no name, but its pages were filled with handwritten entries detailing eerie events. Passengers disappearing, shadows with no source, and a train that fed on fear. Her pulse quickened as she flipped through the final pages. The last entry read, "The train is alive. It wants us. And once you're aboard, you'll never leave." A sudden thud echoed through the carriage, followed by a low, guttural groan. Eleanor froze, the journal slipping from her hands. Behind her, Thomas appeared, his face pale. "You've seen it now, haven't you?" he whispered. The train pressed on, its eerie whistle cutting through the night. Eleanor's heart raced as she clutched the journal. Thomas led her back to their carriage, both on edge. The other passengers sat silently, their eyes darting to the door as if expecting something or someone to appear. Moments later, the door at the front of the carriage slid open with a hiss. The conductor entered. He was tall and thin, his uniform impeccably clean but dated, as if plucked from a bygone era. His eyes were cold, calculating, and they seemed to pierce through each passenger in turn. "Good evening, travelers," he said, his voice smooth yet unsettling. "I trust your journey has been enlightening." Eleanor's grip on the journal tightened. The conductor's gaze landed on her, and a ghost of a smile played on his lips. "Ah, you found our little record. Many have come before you, seeking answers. Few find them. Fewer still leave with them. What is this train?" Eleanor demanded, her voice steady despite her fear. The conductor tilted his head. "This is no ordinary train, my dear. It is a vessel, a living entity. It feeds on fear, despair, and regret. And those who board it. He paused, his smile growing. Become a part of it. Thomas stood abruptly. Why bring us here? What do you want? The conductor's expression darkened. The train needs sustenance, and you provide it. But beware. If you try to resist, the consequences will be unpleasant. With that, he turned on his heel and disappeared into the next carriage. The door slid shut behind him with a finality that made Eleanor's stomach twist. Thomas sank back into his seat, his hands trembling. We need to find a way out, he muttered. Eleanor nodded, determination hardening her resolve. They had to act fast before it was too late. The train sped through the night, the landscape outside a blur of darkness. Eleanor and Thomas worked together, scouring the journal for any clue that could help them. The entries grew more disturbing the further they read, describing passengers who vanished, only to reappear as shadowy figures bound to the train. The journal hinted at the engine room, a place no one dared enter. The heart of the train. One entry called it. If they were to stop the train, they would need to go there. Summoning her courage, Eleanor led the way through the carriages. The air grew colder with each step, and the whispers intensified, forming fragmented words. Stay. Turn back, no escape. They reached the door to the engine room. It was old and rusted, yet it pulsed faintly, as if alive. Eleanor hesitated before pushing it open. Inside, the engine room was unlike anything she had imagined. The walls were covered in a dark, veined substance that pulsed rhythmically, like the chambers of a beating heart. The engine itself glowed with an otherworldly light, its gears and pistons moving in unnatural, fluid motions. It was not mechanical, it was organic. Thomas staggered back, his face pale. It's alive, he whispered. A deep, resonant voice filled the room, vibrating through their bones. You have entered my core, it said, and now you belong to me. The conductor appeared from the shadows, his eyes glowing with a malevolent light. You see now, he said, gesturing to the pulsing engine. This train is a creation of pain and despair. It feeds on your fears and regrets, growing stronger with every soul it claims. Eleanor felt the walls closing in, the weight of the train's presence suffocating, but her eyes landed on a large, rusted lever near the engine. Could this be the key to stopping it? Before she could act, the conductor stepped forward. Choose wisely, he warned. Pull that lever, and you risk everything. Eleanor's mind raced as the conductor's words echoed around her. The lever loomed before her, its rusted surface slick with condensation. It was the only hope of stopping the train, but the cost could be catastrophic. Thomas grabbed her arm. Eleanor, think about this, he said, his voice shaking. If we derail the train, we might die. But if we don't, we'll never leave. The train groaned, its walls pulsing more intensely. The whispers now screamed, incoherent but filled with agony. The train was alive, and it was desperate to keep them. Eleanor took a deep breath. We can't let this thing continue, she said. It's taken too many lives. She stepped forward, her hand hovering over the lever. The conductor's voice rang out louder and more commanding. You will doom them all, he bellowed. This train is eternal. You cannot destroy what cannot die. But Eleanor didn't waver. With a final glance at Thomas, she gripped the lever and pulled. The train let out an earth-shattering roar. The walls began to buckle, the pulsing engine spasming violently. Sparks flew, and the entire structure trembled as if in its death throes. Eleanor and Thomas braced themselves as the train derailed, crashing into the darkness. The sound of metal screeching against metal was deafening, followed by an eerie silence. Eleanor's eyes fluttered open. She lay on the cold, damp ground, surrounded by the wreckage of the train. The fog was lifting, revealing a desolate landscape. Groaning, she sat up, searching for Thomas. A few passengers stirred nearby, coughing and calling out in confusion. Thomas appeared, helping others to their feet. Relief flooded Eleanor as she saw him unharmed. But something felt off. The oppressive weight of the train's presence was gone, yet a faint unease lingered. As the survivors gathered, Thomas held up the journal. "Look," he said, his voice hollow. The final page now bore a new entry, written in Eleanor's handwriting. "The train still lives." Before they could process the words, a distant whistle echoed through the air. The survivors turned, their blood running cold. In the distance, another train appeared, identical to the one that had just crashed. It slowed as it approached the station, its doors creaking open, inviting the next set of passengers aboard. Eleanor stared, her heart sinking. The cycle was far from over. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the quiet streets of Greystone. The town had an unshakable stillness, broken only by the occasional whistle of a distant train. Lena had lived here her entire life, and though she loved its calm, she often found herself craving a mystery to solve. As a librarian, she thrived on uncovering hidden truths buried in dusty books and forgotten records. Her footsteps echoed on the worn wooden platform as she approached the railway station. It was a relic of a busier era, now used mostly by freight trains passing through. She had come to pick up a parcel of old newspapers for the library, but something else caught her eye. A piece of paper pinned to the station's bulletin board. The timetable was yellowed with age, its edges frayed. At first glance, it appeared to list train schedules, but Lena's brow furrowed as she read the contents. Instead of destinations, it displayed names, dates, and times. The latest entry read, Peter Madsen, October 15th, 8:43 p.m. Her heart skipped a beat. Peter Madsen had died just days ago in a freak accident, a fact she had noted while sorting obituaries for the local archive. A chill ran down her spine as she scanned the list. The names were all familiar. These were Greystone's dead. The station master's office door creaked open, and Harold stepped out, his eyes narrowing as he saw her staring at the board. "You shouldn't be looking at that," he said, his voice low. But Lena couldn't tear her eyes away. "What is this?" she asked, her voice trembling. Harold sighed heavily. "It's not a train schedule," he muttered. "It's a death schedule." The next morning, Lena sat at her desk in the library, surrounded by stacks of old newspapers. The timetable had haunted her thoughts all night, and now she was determined to uncover the truth. She flipped through the papers, cross-referencing obituaries with the names and dates on the timetable. Her initial suspicion was confirmed. Every name listed corresponded to someone who had died in the town, each on the exact date and time noted. The thought sent a shiver down her spine. Is it predicting these deaths or causing them? Unable to resist, she returned to the station that afternoon, hoping to find more clues. Harold was there, as she expected, sitting in his usual spot near the ticket booth. His weathered face was a mask of indifference, but Lena could see a flicker of unease in his eyes as she approached. "I need answers, Harold," she said, holding up a notebook filled with her findings. "This schedule, it's more than a coincidence. You know something about it." Harold glanced around nervously before motioning her closer. "That timetable's been there longer than I've worked here," he said quietly. "I've seen people try to ignore it, try to change what's written. None of them succeeded. Why not?" Lena pressed. Harold shook his head. "Because the train is always on time." The weight of his words settled over her like a heavy fog. She hesitated before asking the question she dreaded most. "What happens if your name is on the list?" Harold's eyes darkened. "Then you've got two choices," he said. "You can wait and see how it happens, or you can try to run. But either way, the train won't stop until it gets what it came for." Lena's hands trembled as she opened the station door later that evening. She had spent the rest of the day wrestling with Harold's ominous warning, but it wasn't until she saw her own name on the timetable, Lena Price, October 18th, 9:15 p.m., that the full weight of her situation hit her. 3 days left. Panic surged through her veins as she rushed home, her mind racing with possibilities. There had to be a way to escape this. She pored over every detail in her notes, trying to piece together a plan. Could she leave town? Destroy the timetable? Warn someone? Determined to test the timetable's power, Lena returned to the station the next day with a pair of scissors. She ripped the paper from the board and shredded it into pieces, her breathing ragged with adrenaline. For a brief moment, she felt a surge of relief, but as she turned to leave, her heart dropped. The timetable was back on the board, intact and untouched. She stepped closer, her name glaring at her once more. That evening, Lena confronted Harold again. "Why does it come back?" she demanded. "Why can't we stop it?" Harold sighed deeply. "You think you're the first one to try. People have burned it, buried it, even tried to replace it with a blank sheet. But it always comes back." Lena's voice shook. "Then what am I supposed to do?" Harold leaned forward, his expression grim. "You prepare," he said. "You make peace with what's coming. Because if you fight it, the train will take more than your life. It'll take your soul." The clock in the station struck 9, and Lena felt the minutes slipping away. She was running out of time. And hope. The day of October 18th arrived far too quickly. Lena spent the morning in a haze, her mind drifting between fear and disbelief. By nightfall, she found herself once again at the station, staring at the timetable as the minutes ticked down. 9:10 p.m. The platform was eerily quiet, the air thick with anticipation. Lena clutched her notebook, scanning her surroundings for any sign of the train. She half expected Harold to appear and offer one last piece of cryptic advice, but he was nowhere to be seen. Then, at precisely 9:15 p.m., the train whistle echoed through the air. A sleek, black locomotive emerged from the darkness, its headlight piercing the fog. It pulled into the station with an unsettling precision, its brakes hissing like a serpent. Lena stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. The door slid open with a mechanical groan, revealing an empty interior bathed in cold, dim light. She hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to run. But something compelled her to step forward. "If I board this train, maybe I can find out the truth. Maybe I can stop it." With a deep breath, Lena climbed aboard. The doors closed behind her, and the train lurched forward, plunging into the night. Inside, the carriage was silent except for the hum of the engine. The walls were lined with old wooden panels, and the seats were worn but clean. Yet the atmosphere felt oppressive, as though the train itself was watching her. As she moved through the carriages, she noticed faint shadows flickering at the edges of her vision. Whispers echoed around her, too faint to understand but loud enough to set her nerves on edge. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the temperature plummeted. A figure appeared at the end of the carriage, a tall, faceless conductor dressed in black. He raised a hand, pointing directly at her. "Lena Price," he intoned in a voice that resonated through the train. "Your time has come." The train plunged into darkness, and Lena braced herself for whatever came next. The next morning, the residents of Greystone woke to find the station eerily empty. There was no sign of Lena, and no one recalled hearing a train the previous night. Rumors spread quickly. Some believed she had left town. Others whispered of a more sinister fate. Harold sat alone in the station master's office, staring at the timetable. Lena's name had vanished from the list, replaced by another, Michael Reeves, October 21st, 10:30 p.m. He sighed heavily, the weight of the timetable's curse pressing down on him. Over the years, he had watched many townsfolk vanish under its shadow, each disappearance more painful than the last. He had long since given up hope of breaking the cycle. As he locked the office door for the night, Harold paused at the platform. The air was still, but he knew it wouldn't be for long. The train would return, as it always did, punctual and unrelenting. Meanwhile, in town, Lena's absence left a void. Those closest to her struggled to understand what had happened. Among them was Sarah, Lena's younger sister, who had been away at college. She returned to Greystone upon hearing the news, determined to uncover the truth about her sister's disappearance. One evening, Sarah visited the station, her curiosity piqued by the whispers of a cursed timetable. She found Harold there, his expression weary. "You don't want to get involved," he warned her. "The timetable only brings pain." But Sarah was resolute. She noticed the name Michael Reeves on the board and vowed to stop whatever was coming. Harold's eyes darkened. "Be careful," he said. "Some things are better left alone." 3 days later, Michael Reeves' name disappeared from the timetable, just as Lena's had before him. In its place, a new name appeared. Sarah Price, October 25th, 11:45 p.m. The cycle was unbroken. Sarah stood before the timetable, her resolve hardening. She knew her time was limited, but she wouldn't back down. If the train wanted her, she would be ready. As the fateful night approached, the town braced itself for another disappearance. Sarah spent her remaining time gathering information, determined to uncover the train's origin. She believed that understanding its power was the key to ending the curse. On October 25th, she arrived at the station, her heart steady but her mind racing. The train pulled in precisely on time, its whistle piercing the stillness. The doors opened, and Sarah stepped aboard, determined to face the entity head-on. As the train vanished into the night, Harold watched from the platform, his expression a mixture of sorrow and resignation. He knew the cycle would continue, but for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps Sarah would succeed where others had failed. The train's whistle echoed through the misty valley, a haunting sound that sent ripples through the still air. Sam stood on the platform, their breath visible in the cool mountain air. The historic steam train loomed before them, its brass fixtures gleaming faintly despite the overcast sky. The train was a marvel of old-world craftsmanship, its wooden carriages exuding a timeless charm. Sam adjusted their backpack and stepped aboard, greeted by the rich scent of polished wood and aged upholstery. The interior was warm, lit by soft, golden lamps that swayed gently with the train's subtle movements. Sam chose a seat near the back, close to the caboose, eager to enjoy the scenic journey. As the train began its steady ascent through the mountains, Sam leaned back and closed their eyes, savoring the rhythmic clatter of the wheels. But their peace was short-lived. A faint sound drifted from the rear of the train, a soft, persistent whisper. Curious, Sam glanced toward the caboose. The whispers were barely audible, like voices carried on the wind. Sam frowned, leaning slightly toward the source. Was it their imagination? A shadow passed through the carriage. It was the conductor, a middle-aged man with sharp features and a stern expression. He noticed Sam's gaze and paused, his grip tightening on the polished brass rail. "Best to stay clear of the caboose," he said quietly, his tone carrying a hint of warning. Without waiting for a reply, he continued down the aisle. Sam watched him go, their curiosity piqued. The whispers seemed to grow louder as the train plunged deeper into the mist. Sam couldn't shake the strange feeling the conductor's words had left behind. The whispers persisted, faint but insistent, each time they neared the caboose. They seemed to form fragmented words, though Sam couldn't quite make them out. The train wound its way through the misty mountains, the landscape outside a shifting blur of towering trees and sheer cliffs. Inside, the passengers carried on as though nothing was amiss. A couple near the front chatted softly, and an older man dozed with his hat tipped over his face. No one else seemed to notice the whispers. Sam leaned across the aisle, catching the eye of a young woman engrossed in a novel. "Hey," Sam said quietly. "Do you hear that?" The woman glanced up, her brow furrowed. "Hear what?" "Whispers," Sam said, "from the caboose." The woman shook her head, offering a polite but dismissive smile. "Probably just the wind," she said before returning to her book. Sam frowned. The more they listened, the clearer the whispers became, though they still made little sense. The fragments of sound carried an odd weight, as if laced with desperation. At the next stop, Sam lingered near the caboose while other passengers stretched their legs. They peered through the small window, but the interior was shrouded in shadow. Curiosity gets the best of us sometimes. Sam turned to see the conductor standing nearby. His eyes narrowed. "You really should stay away from that car," he said, his voice low. "It's for your own good." The words only fueled Sam's determination. Whatever secrets the caboose held, they were now determined to uncover them. Later that evening, when most passengers were either asleep or distracted, Sam seized their opportunity. The train had settled into a steady rhythm, and the conductor was nowhere in sight. Quietly, Sam made their way to the rear of the train. The door to the caboose was unlocked, creaking slightly as they pushed it open. A rush of cold air greeted them, along with the heavy scent of dust and age. Sam stepped inside, their eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering in from a single overhead lamp. The interior was eerily still. Old luggage sat in the corners, covered in a thick layer of dust. Photographs in cracked frames adorned a small wooden shelf, their faded images frozen in time. Sam moved closer, inspecting the faces of the passengers in the pictures, men, women, and children, all dressed in attire from decades past. The whispers intensified, filling the small space with a ghostly chorus. Sam's name echoed faintly among them, sending a shiver down their spine. They turned, their heart pounding, but the room was empty. On a nearby table, Sam spotted a leather-bound journal. Its cover was brittle, its pages yellowed and fragile. They opened it carefully, scanning the entries. The journal belonged to a passenger who had been aboard the train years ago. The final entry detailed a tragic accident, derailed tracks, a storm, and the caboose plunging into a ravine. Sam's pulse quickened as they read. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. The words were clearer now. "Help us." Suddenly, the temperature plummeted. Sam's breath formed in visible puffs, and faint shapes began to materialize in the corners of the room. They watched in growing horror as ghostly figures emerged, their eyes hollow, their faces etched with sorrow. Sam backed away, their heart racing. The spirits stood silently at first, their translucent forms flickering like candlelight. Then they spoke, their voices merging into a mournful plea. "Help us, free us." Before Sam could respond, the door behind them slammed open. The conductor stormed in, his face pale but resolute. "I told you to stay out of here," he said, his voice sharp with fear. Sam gestured toward the spirits. "What is this? Who are they?" The conductor sighed heavily, his shoulders slumping. "They're the lost souls of those who died in the crash," he said. "They're bound to this caboose, unable to move on." Sam's mind raced. Why are they trapped here?" The conductor stepped forward, his expression grim. The train was never supposed to leave that day. A storm was coming, but the owner insisted we run the route. The caboose derailed, and everyone inside. They never made it. The spirits pressed closer, their faces pleading. One stepped forward, a young boy clutching a tattered teddy bear. "Please," he whispered. "We just want to go home." The conductor's voice hardened. "They're trapped because of the curse tied to this train. Anyone who spends too much time in this caboose risks sharing their fate." He looked directly at Sam. "That includes you." The spirits' pleas grew louder, more desperate. Sam felt a tug on their sleeve, cold and insistent. The boy's hollow eyes locked onto theirs. "Don't leave us," he begged. The conductor grabbed Sam's arm. "You have to get out now," he said. "You can't help them. No one can." Sam hesitated, torn between compassion and self-preservation. The caboose seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, as if eager to claim another soul. "Please," the spirits whispered in unison. With a final, wrenching decision, Sam allowed the conductor to pull them toward the door. The door to the caboose slammed shut behind them, cutting off the whispers instantly. Sam stumbled back into the main carriage, their chest heaving with panic. The warmth of the train returned, but the chill of the caboose clung to their skin. The conductor leaned against the wall, his face drawn and weary. "You're lucky you got out," he said, his voice low. "Most don't." Sam sank into a seat, their hands trembling. "Why didn't you warn me before?" "I tried," the conductor replied. "But some things people have to see for themselves to believe." Sam's mind raced with questions, but the weight of what they'd just experienced left them too shaken to speak. They stared out the window, the dark forest rushing past, feeling the train's rhythm beneath them. The other passengers remained oblivious, chatting softly or dozing in their seats. Sam envied their ignorance, but knew they could never unsee what had just happened. The faces of the spirits lingered in their thoughts, especially the boy's hollow, pleading eyes. The conductor broke the silence. "Listen," he said. "You've seen what's back there, and now you know the danger. But you can't speak of this to anyone. The more people know, the more curious they'll get. And curiosity gets people killed." Sam nodded reluctantly, though they doubted they could ever truly forget. As the train continued its journey, the oppressive weight of the caboose seemed to fade, leaving an uneasy calm. But Sam knew the whispers would haunt them long after the train reached its destination. When the train pulled into the final station, Sam disembarked, their legs unsteady. The crisp morning air felt like a reprieve, but the memories of the caboose lingered. They glanced back at the train, half expecting to see a ghostly face staring back at them. The conductor gave a brief nod, a silent reminder to keep what they'd seen a secret. Sam turned and walked away, vowing never to board that train again. But as the last passengers disembarked, a new traveler approached the platform, a young man with bright eyes and an eager smile. He paused near the caboose, tilting his head as if hearing something faint. The train whistle blew, signaling its next departure. The young man hesitated, his curiosity piqued by the whispers. The cycle had begun again.